Somewhere in the president's office, a member of his own guard had hidden a recorder under the couch. For months, he switches the tapes himself, and nobody knows. On the 28th of November 2000, a Ukrainian opposition leader stands up in Parliament and presses play. The voice on the tape is identified later by an American audio lab as the president of Ukraine. He's talking about a journalist, a young man who's just spent months publishing the kind of stories presidents don't forgive. On the tape, he talks about driving him out of the country, stripping him and handing him to someone who will make him disappear. The journalist has already been missing for 10 weeks. This is the story about what happens next, not just to him, but to the tape itself and to everyone whose voices are on it. Because in the end, the state doesn't just get away with it. It gets a court up to agree, on paper, that the tape was never really there at all. It's a story with a beginning that's brutally simple and an ending that takes 2 decades, 3 courts, and 1 international human rights ruling to even partially untangle. To understand what happened to Georgiy Gongadze, it helps to understand what Ukraine's press was already living through by the year 2000. Leonid Kuchma had been president since 1994, presiding over an economy hollowed out by privatization deals that made a small circle of insiders extremely rich, and a state apparatus that treated independent journalism less as an annoyance than as a live threat. Reporters covering corruption in this period didn't just get threatening phone calls. Several were beaten, some left the country. The ones who stayed learned to write carefully or not to write certain names at all. Georgiy Gongadze had already decided he wasn't going to write carefully. Gongadze wasn't the only one. In the same period, at least a handful of other Ukrainian post-Soviet journalists working similar territory, corruption, organised crimes overlap with the state, were beaten. They disappeared or killed outright. Cases this channel will return to, I'm sure, at another time. What makes Gongadze's case one history remembers isn't that it was unique, it's that, for once, a recording existed. He was married to Miroslava Gongadze, a lawyer, and by the time Ukrainska Pravda launched, they had twin daughters, barely a year old. She would later say she'd known in a general way that his reporting made him a target. What she hadn't known was how little that knowledge would end up being able to protect him. Gongadze was born in Tbilisi in 1969 to a Georgian father and a Ukrainian mother, and trained as a philologist in Kyiv before drifting into journalism, almost by accident. First radio, then television, in a decade when both were tightly watched. He'd already lived through one war by the time he came to Ukrainska Pravda. As a young man, he'd fought in the Georgia's civil conflict and had been wounded there. This was an experience that friends later said left him very little patience for people who told him a story was too dangerous to tell. In April 2000, together with a colleague, Olena Pritula, he launched something Ukraine hadn't really had before, a news outlet that existed only online. Ukrainska Pravda was cheap to run, almost impossible to shut down through the usual channels. There was no printing press to seize, and there was no broadcast license to revoke. And this was aimed from its first stories directly at the people of the top of the state. It worked exactly as well as it sounds like it would. Within months, Ukrainska Pravda was one of the most read political outlets in the country, and Gongadze was one of the most exposed journalists in it. The site's early archive reads like a target list of its own. Contracts awarded to insiders, arms deals routed through shell companies and private businesses, the interest of officials who were supposed to be regulating the same industries. None of it was rumour dressed up as journalism. Gongadze's method was slow and documentary. Paper trails, company registries, the kind of sourcing that's hard to dismiss and even harder to threaten into silence because there's no single confidential source to lean on. That made him more dangerous to the people he was writing about, not less. A story built on an anonymous tip can be discredited quite easily. However, a story built on a company's own filed paperwork can't. Ukrainska Pravda would go on to outlive nearly everyone who wanted it silenced. Kuchma left office in 2005. Kravchenko and Pukhach are both gone from public life for very different reasons, and the outlet Georgiy Gongadze and Pritula built with almost no money is still, a quarter of a century later, one of the most cited news sources in Ukrainian politics. The afterlife is part of this story too. Killing the founder didn't kill what he had founded. On the 14th of July 2000, a little over 2 months before he disappeared, Gongadze wrote directly to Ukraine's Prosecutor General. He reported that his relatives, friends and colleagues were being questioned by police about an incident he said he knew nothing about, and that he was being followed by an unidentified men driving an unidentified car with a very specific number plate. He asked plainly for protection and for whoever was doing this to be identified and stopped. Nothing came of it. No investigation opened, no protection was assigned. 5 years later, the European Court of Human Rights would rule that this letter, sitting unanswered in a prosecutor's file, was the moment Ukraine's own state had been given clear evidence of a real and specific threat to a citizen's life, and had done nothing whatsoever with it. The ruling is the evidentiary spine of everything that follows. This isn't a case where the state can claim it never saw the danger coming. It saw it, in writing, 2 months early. On the evening of the 16th of September 2000, Gongadze left a colleague's apartment and hailed what he thought was a taxi on Lezia Ukrainia Boulevard. It wasn't a taxi, it was a decoy, arranged in advance by a surveillance team from the Interior Ministry's External Directorate, the unit responsible, on paper, for tracking organised crime. The team had been watching him for 2 days already. It was led by a general named Alexei Pukhach, appointed to head that directorate only 2 weeks earlier, seemingly for this reason. The operation itself was built with a bureaucrat's attention to detail rather than a killer's surveillance logs. A rotation of vehicles, a cover story for the driver rehearsed in advance. None of it reads like an act of passion. It reads like a work order that happened to end in a body. The driver told Gongadze the front seat was broken and asked him to hop into the back. 3 more men were already inside. According to the court record built for more than a decade later, Gongadze was overpowered, driven out of the city. Along the way, the group stopped more than once to swap the car's number plates and collected a length of rope and a spade from a house belonging to one of the officers' relatives. Preparation, not improvisation. He was killed in a woodland outside of a small town called Tarashcha, roughly 70 kilometers from Kyiv. Pukhach did it himself, the court found, on the direct orders of his supervisor. Afterward, the group drove back toward the city and stopped along the way for a meal at a roadside cafe, an ordinary errand on an ordinary road the same evening. It's the kind of detail that doesn't need embellishing to land. 4 men just killed a journalist on the orders of a government minister, and the next item on their evening was dinner. What Pukach's team did to the body afterward wasn't incidental cruelty, it was engineering. The head was removed and never recovered at the scene. The remains were burned and buried under the earth and dry grass before the group left. Every one of those steps served a single specific goal: to make sure that whatever was eventually found could never be confirmed cleanly and immediately as Georgiy Gongadze. It worked for a long time, exactly as intended. A decapitated body surfaced in the Tarashcha forest that November. It would take until 2009 for further remains, skull fragments, to turn up in the same region. And even then, the identification wasn't clean. Gongadze's own mother, given access to those fragments, said publicly that she didn't believe they were her sons. Georgiy Gongadze wasn't formally laid to rest until 2016, 16 years after he disappeared. A body that can't be confirmed is a case that can't quite close, and a case that can't quite close is a great deal easier for a very long time to file as unsolved rather than admit it was a cover-up. With Ukraine's own institutions offering nothing, Myroslava Gongadze did something her husband's killers hadn't planned for. She took the case out of the country entirely, filing an application against the Ukrainian state itself with the European Court of Human Rights in September 2002, less than 2 years after he disappeared and years before anyone would be convicted of anything. It took until November 2005 for the court to rule. When it did, it didn't simply find that Ukraine had failed to solve the murder. It found something more specific and more damning, that the state had known from Gongadze's own letter of a real threat to his life and had failed to act, a violation of his right to life. This was under Article 2 of the Convention. It further found that the investigation itself had been conducted in a way that violated his widow's own right to be free of inhuman treatment, citing the years she spent being stonewalled, misled, and denied access to her husband's case file by the same authorities meant to be pursuing it on her behalf. She would say afterward that the point was never the money the judgment awarded her. It was making a Ukrainian court's failure part of the permanent legal record of a European institution, somewhere the file couldn't quietly disappear. The tape that opened this film came from a presidential guard named Mykola Melnichenko. Mykola, who says he began recording the conversations in Kuchma's office out of his own growing alarm of what he was hearing over many months on his own initiative with no authorization from anyone above him. Once he had left the country, Melnichenko had the recordings examined in the United States by a private lab called Bechtek. This was run by a former FBI audio verification specialist. Their conclusion, specific to the excerpts that they were given concerning Gongadze, not a verification of the full archive, must be noted, which reportedly runs past 1,000 hours, was that the segments collected were unedited, and that the voices belonged to Kuchma, his interior minister Yuri Kravchenko, and the head of security service Leonid Dekach. On those excerpts, the men can be heard discussing what to do about the journalist who kept publishing things they didn't want published. There was talks about deportation, intimidation, handing him to people who'd make the problem disappear. Ukraine's own government has never accepted the tapes as genuine evidence inside the country where the crime happened. Officially, to this day, they remain unrecognized. Melnichenko himself paid for the recording the way whistleblowers usually do. He fled Ukraine within days of the tapes surfacing, was granted political asylum in the United States, and spent years afterward being alternately courted and dismissed by the same Ukrainian officials the tapes implicated, invited home to testify when it was politically convenient, denounced as an unreliable fugitive with a state secrets charge hanging over him when it wasn't. He never faced prosecution in Ukraine for the recordings themselves. He also never got the admission he'd spent a career risking everything for. The tapes didn't need to be admissible in a Ukrainian court to detonate politically. Within weeks of Moroz playing them in a parliament, protesters were in the streets under the banner Ukraine without Kuchma. International observers, the OSCE and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, among them, began pressing Kyiv directly for a credible investigation. This pressure would continue largely unanswered for the next 2 decades. It's widely treated inside Ukraine and outside it as the dress rehearsal for the Orange Revolution 4 years later, the first time in independent Ukraine's history that a taped scandal rather than an election nearly brought a sitting president down, which means a killing meant to silence one inconvenient journalist ended up destabilizing the government that ordered it. And the government survived anyway for years on one argument, that none of it could be proven in a way its own courts would accept. There's a quieter layer underneath that, worth naming directly. Even after Kuchma's opponents took power in the Orange Revolution, the new administration was reportedly in no great hurry to put the tapes into evidence either, because by some accounts at least 2 of its own senior officials could also be heard on them, on unrelated matters they'd rather not have re-examined under oath. The system that replaced Kuchma's had its own reasons to leave the recordings exactly where they were: real, widely believed, and never quite admissible. The tape's credibility, in fact, came from somewhere other than Gongadze's case entirely. A separate excerpt, Kuchma apparently authorizing the sale of a sophisticated radar system to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, indirect breach of a UN embargo. This was independently tested and authenticated by the US government's labs, unconnected to Bechtech. That finding was serious enough to cost Ukraine years of frozen military cooperation with Washington. It also meant that when the same recordings were used to discuss Gongadze, the voices on them had already been proven by an entirely separate scandal to be exactly who Melnichenko said they were, none of which translated into Ukrainian cooperation. When the US announced it would send FBI investigators to Kyiv to assist directly with the Gongadze case, the team that arrived was denied meaningful access to evidence and went home essentially empty-handed. Officially, the offer of cooperation had been accepted. In practice, it changed nothing. Interior Minister Yuri Kravchenko, the man identified on the tapes discussing Gongadze, was scheduled to give testimony in the case on the 4th of March 2005. Hours before he was due to appear, he was found dead in his home outside Kyiv. He died of 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The official ruling for his death was suicide. A note was reportedly found in which Kravchenko denied any guilt and described himself as a casualty of political intrigue around Kuchma. His family disputed the finding overnight and commissioned their own forensic review, which concluded that inflicting 2 gunshot wounds to one's own head is, to put it plainly, not something the human body cooperates with easily. This film isn't going to resolve that dispute for you. It's going to give you the documented fact: 2 wounds, hours before testimony, and a family's forensic rebuttal that was never formally overturned. 3 of the officers who carried out the abduction, Kostenko, Protosov and Popovich were convicted in 2008 and sentenced to 12 to 13 years each. One of them died in prison before his term served. Puchma himself had already been named publicly once. In January 2001, opposition newspaper article headlined roughly, "Who shadowed Gongadze?" But it would be another 2 years before he was even briefly detained in 2003. He was detained on suspicion of organising the surveillance operation around Gongadze. He was released almost immediately after the prosecutor who authorised his arrest was removed from the case. There's a detail worth sitting with about the years he spent still a serving officer before any of this became public. In August 2003, Puchma reportedly received the gift of a new 3-room apartment in an elite Kyiv housing complex. This was reported by the press at the time. Who provided it and why was never established in any proceedings. Nobody has ever proven the connection. It sits in the record as exactly the kind of loose thread that this genre exists to notice. He then vanished for nearly 6 years, reportedly living for at least part of that time under a new identity in a remote village roughly 180 kilometers from Kyiv, farming, keeping livestock, drinking with his neighbors, apparently unrecognized. He was finally arrested in July 2009 in that same village. His trial, which began in July 2011, was held entirely behind closed doors. The court ruled the indictment itself contained state secrets and refused to repeat requests filed by Gongadze's own widow through her lawyer to open the proceedings to the public. Press freedom organisations abroad called it exactly what it looked like, a murder trial about a censored journalist being tried in secret. In January 2013, Puchma was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court's finding was explicit. He had acted on the direct orders of Kravchenko, the same man who had died from 2 gunshots the day he was due to testify. Asked in court whether he understood the ruling, Puchma said this: "I will be satisfied when Kuchma and Litvin sit here next to me." He appealed. Process dragged on for years, moving between Ukraine's Supreme Specialized Court and, after a 2017 judicial reorganization, its new Supreme Court, a delay long enough that one of the judges handling it was later formally reprimanded for the pace of the proceedings. On the 2nd of July 2021, more than 4 years after the appeal was first lodged, the Supreme Court dismissed Puchma's final claims outright. Every level of appeal available to him across multiple court systems and the better part of a decade reached exactly the same conclusion. Neither Kuchma nor Litvin has ever been convicted of anything connected to this case. Criminal proceedings against Kuchma himself finally opened in 2011, a full decade after the murder. These were built of necessity on the Melnichenko tapes because there was almost nothing else to build them on. And this is the beat the whole film has been walking towards. In October 2011, Ukraine's courts ruled that evidence gathered by someone with no authorization to gather it couldn't be used against the defendant. Melnichenko recording his president without permission was exactly that. The tapes, the only direct evidence connecting the country's head of state to the murder of a journalist, were disqualified by the state's own legal process for the precise quality that made them credible. Nobody with the power to stop him had known he was recording. The case against Kuchma was quashed. Ukraine's higher courts upheld that decision on appeal, and again at the final level in June 2012. Through all of it, the Council of Europe's own rapporteur on the case wrote directly to Ukraine's Prosecutor General, formally putting on record his conclusion that no serious investigation into who gave the original orders had actually taken place. A diplomatic way of saying on paper that the state's own account of its efforts didn't hold up. It changed nothing procedurally. It's simply part of the permanent record now. An international body telling Ukraine in writing that it knew the investigation wasn't real. This is what officially nothing happened looks like once a state has had a decade to get good at it. Not a cover-up in the crude old-fashioned sense. No missing files, no denied crime. A working court following its own procedural rules to the letter, arriving at a result that happens to protect the one man every piece of testimony in the case points towards. Georgiy Gongadze was finally buried in 2016. Alexei Pukach's life sentence was upheld by Ukraine's Supreme Court in 2021, and he remains in prison as of this filming, the only person ever to be held fully accountable for the killing. In 2018, the Council of Europe's own Committee of Ministers formally noted with evident frustration that the investigation into who ordered Gongadze's murder had by then dragged on for 18 years without resolution. It still hasn't resolved. In 2018, the Council of Europe's own Committee of Ministers formally noted with evident frustration that the investigation into who ordered Gongadze's murder had by then dragged on for 18 years without resolution. The committee was still formally reviewing Ukraine's compliance with the 2005 judgment as late as December 2020, 15 years after the ruling, and still finding the same open question sitting exactly where it had been left. Who gave the order, and why has nobody above Pukach ever answered for it? The men every piece of testimony points towards have never spent a day answering for it. As recently as late 2025, Kuchma was still giving interviews denying any connection to the killing whatsoever and pointing instead at Russian intelligence. Miroslava Gongadze has spent the years since building a career in Washington in press freedom advocacy, turning the case that took her husband into permanent argument for exactly the kind of protection Ukraine failed to give him when he asked for it directly, in writing, 2 months before he died. Ukrainska Pravda is still publishing 25 years and one dead founder later. And somewhere in a Ukrainian evidence room there is a set of cassette tapes that a court has ruled nobody in the country is legally permitted to believe. That is the case of Georgiy Gongadze.